Paris, 1705. A cartographer named Guillaume de Lille spreads a map across his work table and writes, in careful ink, a name that will persist for 200 years and then vanish so completely that most educated people today have never encountered it. Tartaria. On some European maps of the period, the label stretched across more territory than Rome and China combined. Kings consulted atlases where it dominated half the known world. Encyclopedias devoted serious entries to it. Travelers described cities, courts, roads, and peoples that readers back home folded into this single broad category without questioning what the category actually meant. Then the name disappeared. Not the land, not the people, the label, the frame, the category that had organized an entire civilizational space in European imagination. Gone. Replaced. Folded into something else. This is not a story about a lost empire. It is a story about how European maps, empires, and institutions decided what counted as knowledge, and who paid the price when older names and older peoples were folded into something else entirely. There is a map in the collections of the Library of Congress that stops people cold the first time they see it. It was printed in Amsterdam in 1670. The work of a Dutch cartographer working from sources that were already decades old when he compiled them. The map shows Asia in reasonable detail for its era, with coastlines that are recognizable, major river systems that are mostly correct, and cities marked with the kind of confident precision that suggests the cartographer knew exactly what he was doing. And then, spreading across the entire northern and central portion of the continent, covering a space larger than all of Europe, is a single label, Tartaria. No internal borders, no capital city marked with special prominence, no dynasty name, no language indicated, no religious center identified. Just the word, enormous, filling the space the way a cartographer fills space when he knows a place exists but does not know what to say about it. That map is not unusual. It is typical. Pull any European map of Asia from between 1500 and 1850, and you will find some version of this. The label changes slightly in spelling across time and across national cartographic traditions. The French write Tartary. The English write Tartary. The Dutch write Tartarai. But the geographic gesture is the same in all of them, a vast region, imprecisely bounded, assigned a single name that appears to explain it while actually concealing how little the mapmaker understood about what lay beneath the label. This is the first thing worth understanding about Tartaria, and it matters for everything that follows. The name was never a country. It was never a political entity in the way that France was a political entity, or the Ottoman Empire, or the Chinese dynasties whose names appear on maps of East Asia from the same era. No ruler ever called himself King of Tartaria or Emperor of Tartaria. No capital city served as the administrative center of a Tartarian state. No legal system. No currency. No unified military command operated under that banner. The word Tartaria, in every European source that used it across 5 centuries, referred not to a government but to a geographic zone, a vast and poorly understood region of the Eurasian continent that European observers grouped together under one label because they lacked the information, the interest, or the linguistic access to describe it more precisely. This sounds like a simple point. It is, in fact, the point around which everything else in this investigation turns. Abraham Ortelius, the Flemish cartographer whose Theatrum, Orbis Terrarum, of 1570, is often called the first modern atlas, included Tartaria in his maps with the kind of confident labeling that his era brought to geographic description. His Tartaria stretched from the Volga River and the Caspian Sea all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It covered what we would now call Russia east of the Urals, all of Central Asia, Mongolia, and significant portions of what is now China's northern and western regions. On the Ortelius map, Tartaria is larger than the entire Roman Empire at its greatest extent. The Library of Congress, which holds several copies of Ortelius editions in its cartographic collections, is explicit in its cataloging notes about what this label means and does not mean. The notation attached to these maps observes that Tartaria, as a geographic designation, appears on European maps from the 13th century onward, but that its position and extent vary significantly between different maps, and that it never represented a stable political unit. Later editions of European atlases would subdivide the label, creating distinctions like Tartaria Magna for the region around Mongolia and the steppe, Chinese Tartary for the areas north of China proper, independent Tartary for Central Asian regions, not under Russian or Chinese control, and Russian Tartary for the territories the Russian Empire had absorbed. 4 different Tartarias, on maps produced in the same century, sometimes in the same decade. That is not the cartographic behavior of a civilization describing a real, unified political entity. That is the cartographic behavior of a civilization using a word as a placeholder for its own ignorance about a region it found difficult to categorize, which raises the immediate question, why did the ignorance persist so long? The answer is partly geographic. The Eurasian steppe, the vast grassland belt stretching from the plains of Hungary to the Pacific coast of Russia, presented serious obstacles to European travelers and observers for most of the medieval and early modern period. The distances were enormous by any standard a 16th-century European would have used. The terrain was unfamiliar. The languages spoken across the region were mutually unintelligible and largely unlearned by European scholars. The political structures that organized life on the steppe operated according to principles that European observers, trained to think about governance in terms of fixed territories, hereditary monarchies, and written law codes, consistently failed to understand even when they encountered them directly. The answer is also partly political. European interest in the interior of Asia was shaped almost entirely by 2 concerns: trade and threat. When Asian goods moved along routes that made them available to European markets, Europeans cared about the geography of those routes. When Asian military forces moved in directions that threatened European territories, Europeans cared about the geography of those threats, the detailed understanding of who lived in the interior, how they organized their societies, what their histories were, what their own names for their lands and peoples were. This kind of knowledge had almost no constituency in European intellectual life for most of the period when Tartaria appeared on maps, so the label filled the space that knowledge did not fill. Nicolas Sanson, the official geographer to Louis XIV of France, produced some of the most influential maps of Asia in the mid-17th century. His treatment of the Tartaria region is instructive. He divides the space into several zones and applies different labels to different parts, which looks like increased precision. But the boundaries between his zones do not correspond to any political reality on the ground. They correspond to the limits of the different sources he was working from, which were themselves compilations of earlier sources. Each generation of cartographers inheriting the guesses of the previous generation and adding their own. Guillaume de Lisle, working in Paris in the early 18th century, was one of the more careful cartographers of his era in his treatment of regions where European knowledge was thin. He was willing to leave spaces blank rather than fill them with invented detail, a practice that set him apart from many of his predecessors. His maps of the Tartaria region show a cartographer genuinely wrestling with the limits of his sources. But even de Lisle could not escape the fundamental problem. The word Tartaria was already in the European cartographic vocabulary. It was expected by readers. It was demanded by publishers. And the alternative, admitting that European geography simply did not have adequate information about half the Asian continent, was not commercially or intellectually acceptable in an era when European civilization was deeply invested in the idea of its own knowledge as comprehensive and authoritative. The Jesuit cartographer Matteo Ricci, who lived and worked in China from 1583 until his death in 1610, produced maps that offer a fascinating counterpoint to the European tradition, working from Chinese geographic sources as well as his own observations. Ricci created maps that showed the territories north and west of China with a different vocabulary and a different set of internal distinctions than European maps of the same regions. The areas that European maps called Tartaria appeared in Ricci's work with more specific names. Names drawn from Chinese geographic and historical traditions that were considerably more precise about the identities and locations of the peoples and political structures in those regions. Ricci's maps circulated in both Europe and China and influenced cartographers in both traditions, but his more precise vocabulary did not displace the European habit of using Tartaria as a catch-all label. The label was too convenient, too well established, and too deeply embedded in European mental geography to be replaced by precision. There is something worth sitting with here, because it is easy to read this history and conclude that European cartographers were simply lazy or incompetent. That reading misses something important. The cartographers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were, by the standards of their own time and discipline, often serious and skilled practitioners. The problem was not individual laziness. The problem was structural. European cartography in this era operated on an assumption that the observer's framework was adequate to describe what was being observed, that the categories European civilization used to organize political space, states, empires, kingdoms, territories, were universal categories that could be applied anywhere in the world. When those categories did not fit the reality they were being applied to, the instinct was not to question the categories. The instinct was to force the reality into the available framework. Tartaria is what happens when a civilization tries to describe a world it does not understand using the only vocabulary it has. The label was not a deception. It was not a conspiracy. It was not an attempt to hide something. It was an attempt to name something, made by people who did not have enough information to name it well. Repeated across generations, because the habit of naming it that way was easier to perpetuate than to correct. That distinction between a label that hides and a label that fails to reveal is the distinction that matters most for understanding what the word Tartaria actually was. The conspiracy tradition that has grown up around Tartaria in recent years insists that the label represented something real and specific. A great civilization, a global empire, a technological power deliberately erased from history. This tradition points to the size of the Tartaria label on old maps as evidence of the scale of what was hidden. It points to the disappearance of the label in the 19th century as evidence of deliberate erasure. The straightforward debunking tradition dismisses all of this as obvious nonsense, points out correctly that Tartaria was never a unified political entity, and concludes that there is therefore nothing interesting to investigate. Both traditions miss the actual story. The actual story is not about a hidden empire. It is about the gap between the world as it existed and the world as European cartographic institutions were capable of seeing and describing. That gap was real. It was large. The things that fell into it were not invented empires but actual civilizations, actual peoples, actual political structures and cultural traditions that European cartography was not equipped to represent with any fidelity. What was in the space that Tartaria labeled? That is the question this investigation is built to answer. Not what the conspiracy tradition imagines was there, not the dismissive nothing that the debunking tradition substitutes, but the actual historical content of the space, the civilizations that developed there, the political structures that organized life there, the cities that were built there, the trade networks that crossed it, and the peoples who called it home long before any European cartographer put a label on it. The word Tartaria pointed at something real. It just pointed at it very badly. And the history of what it was actually pointing at, followed carefully through the evidence, is considerably more interesting than any empire that conspiracy theory could invent. Paris, 1705. Guillaume de Lille dips his pen and writes the word. 200 years later, the word is gone from maps. What happened in between is the story. A merchant caravan leaves Samarkand before dawn. The animals are loaded in darkness. The handlers working by touch and habit, adjusting straps and checking loads with the efficiency of people who have done this hundreds of times. By the time the first light reaches the city's eastern gate, the caravan is already moving, heading northeast along a route so well traveled that the ground itself has been worn smooth by centuries of hooves and wheels. The merchant knows this road the way he knows his own courtyard. He knows where the water is reliable and where it is not. He knows which way station has honest weighers and which does not. He knows the names of the families who run the caravanserais at 3-day intervals along the route, because his father knew their fathers. And the relationships that make long-distance trade possible are relationships built across generations, not transactions completed in a single afternoon. He is not a nomad in the sense that European observers would later use that word, meaning rootless, primitive, without civilization. He has a house in Samarkand, a warehouse, an extended family network, and a set of commercial relationships that stretch from Chinese workshops in the east to Persian markets in the west to Byzantine traders on the Black Sea coast. He moves because movement is his business, not because he lacks the capacity for permanence. This merchant, and the world he operated in, is almost entirely absent from the European maps that covered his homeland with the word Tartaria. The grassland belt of Eurasia stretches roughly 5,000 miles from the plains of Hungary to the Pacific coast of what is now the Russian Far East. Ecologists call it the Eurasian steppe. For most of recorded history, the people who lived on it called it home, and they understood it with a precision that European observers never developed. The key to understanding steppe civilization is understanding what grass actually means in an economy built around it. Grass is not a passive backdrop. It is a resource that behaves differently at different times of year, in different locations, under different weather conditions. Steppe grass grew at different rates in different places across different seasons. An economy built on that grass required movement, carefully managed movement, following circuits refined over generations to match the rhythms of grass growth across an enormous landscape. The seasonal migrations of steppe pastoralists were not wandering. They were precision management of a resource that rewarded mobility and punished sedentary exploitation. European observers, from the ancient Greeks through the medieval chroniclers through the Enlightenment geographers, consistently describe steppe peoples as nomads, meaning people without fixed homes, without real cities, without the kind of settled existence that European civilization identified with progress. The word nomad carried an entire theory of social evolution. These were people who had not yet made the transition to settled agriculture, who were therefore at an earlier and less developed stage of human history. That theory was wrong in ways that had enormous consequences for how Europe understood the world beyond its borders. Mobility on the steppe was not a failure to settle. It was a choice, refined across millennia, that allowed steppe economies to sustain large populations and generate substantial wealth in an environment where sedentary farming would have struggled. The families who managed these circuits were not primitive. They were sophisticated economic actors operating within a system finely calibrated to the ecology they inhabited. The economic reality of the steppe extended far beyond the pastoral circuits themselves. Livestock, primarily horses, cattle, sheep, and camels depending on the region, were the primary form of wealth. But the steppe did not exist in economic isolation. It sat at the geographic center of the largest landmass on Earth, and the routes that connected China to Persia, Persia to Byzantium, Byzantium to the trading cities of the Black Sea coast. All of these ran across or near steppe territory. The peoples of the steppe were not peripheral to the trade networks of Eurasia. For most of the period between roughly 300 and 1800 of the Common Era, they were essential to those networks. As producers, as transporters, as protectors, and as consumers of the goods that moved through them, the cities that served as nodes in these networks carry names that most Western-educated people have heard, but few can place with any precision. Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, was a major commercial and cultural center by the time Alexander the Great reached it in 339 before the Common Era, and it remained significant for more than 2,000 years afterward. Bukhara, nearby, was a center of Islamic scholarship and commerce from the 8th century onward, whose intellectual output, during its medieval peak, rivaled anything produced in contemporary Europe. The philosopher and physician Ibn Sina, known in European medical tradition as Avicenna, was born near Bukhara around 980 of the Common Era. His canon of medicine, a comprehensive synthesis of Greek, Islamic, and Indian medical knowledge, remained a standard text in European universities until the 17th century. Bukhara produced him. The region that European maps called Tartaria produced him, Urgench, in what is now Turkmenistan. He was by multiple medieval accounts one of the largest cities in the Islamic world in the 12th and early 13th centuries. It was the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, the major Central Asian power that Genghis Khan systematically destroyed in the campaigns of 1219 through 1221. Population estimates for pre-modern cities are always uncertain, but the scale of its destruction, documented across several independent historical traditions, tells its own story about the city's significance before the Mongols arrived. These were not isolated outposts. They were cities embedded in functioning regional economies, with populations of craftsmen, merchants, scholars, administrators, and religious figures, with architectural traditions, literary cultures, and legal systems of genuine sophistication. The political structures of the steppe were also more sophisticated than the nomad label suggested, though they were sophisticated in ways that European political theory was poorly equipped to recognize. Power on the steppe did not work the way power worked in settled agricultural states. A steppe political leader could not hold territory the way a European king held territory. He could not build walls around it, garrison it with standing armies, and collect taxes from the farmers who worked it, because there were no farmers and no fixed territory in the same sense. What a steppe leader controlled was not land, but people. Specifically the loyalty of other leaders, who in turn commanded the loyalty of their own followers. Steppe political authority was personal, relational, and contingent in ways that confused European observers who were looking for the kind of institutional, territorial authority that organized states in the Western tradition. A successful steppe leader who could command the loyalty of dozens of subordinate chiefs, who could coordinate the movement of tens of thousands of mounted warriors across thousands of miles, who could negotiate trade agreements with settled states along the steppe's periphery and enforce those agreements with credible military threat, was exercising a form of political power that was in many respects more flexible and more capable of rapid expansion than anything available to settled agricultural rulers of the same era. The Huns, who pressured the Roman Empire from the 4th century onward, operated through this kind of political structure. The various Turkic confederations that dominated different portions of the steppe from the 6th century through the 12th operated similarly. The Khazars, who controlled the region north of the Caucasus from roughly the 7th to the 10th century, and whose ruling class converted to Judaism in a decision that remains one of the more remarkable episodes in medieval religious history, built a sophisticated commercial and political state using steppe organizational principles. European cartography grouped all of them under Tartaria. European chronicles distinguished them mainly by the degree of military threat they posed. The result was a sustained failure of understanding that persisted for centuries. There is one more dimension of steppe civilization that deserves attention here, because it is the dimension most thoroughly erased by the nomad label. The steppe was not culturally isolated. It was a corridor. The same mobility that made steppe peoples economically effective as pastoralists also made them extraordinarily effective as carriers of ideas, technologies, artistic traditions, and religious innovations across the Eurasian continent. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and from Central Asia into China along routes that passed through steppe territory and steppe-adjacent oasis cities. Islam spread into Central Asia along the same routes from the 7th century onward and took root there with a depth and sophistication that produced some of the greatest intellectual figures of the medieval Islamic world. The technological exchange between China and the West, which included paper-making, printing, cast iron production, and the use of gunpowder, moved in both directions, along routes where steppe peoples served as intermediaries. Back in Samarkand, the merchant's caravan has been moving for 2 hours now. The city is behind him. The steppe is ahead, vast and specific, in ways that the cartographers in Amsterdam and Paris and London never understood, because they never walked it. The cartographers knew the label. They did not know the road. In the spring of 1241, Mongol forces simultaneously invaded Poland and Hungary in a coordinated campaign planned months in advance. At Legnica, in what is now southwestern Poland, a force assembled in defense of Silesia was destroyed. Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia, died in that battle. At the Saho River in Hungary 2 days later, the main Mongol force under the commanders Batu and Subutai did the same thing to the Hungarian royal army. King Bela IV escaped on horseback. His force did not. The Mongol commanders had divided their armies to prevent either kingdom from reinforcing the other, used feigned retreats to draw cavalry charges and then encircle the pursuing forces, and deployed incendiary devices that produced smoke screens. They had more operational experience against a wider variety of opponents than any European commander of the era could claim. In the days that followed, Mongol forces ranged across Hungary almost unopposed. They burned Pest. They crossed the Danube. They reached the Adriatic coast. For a period of weeks in the spring and summer of 1241, nothing stood between the Mongol armies and the heart of Western Europe except the Mongol commanders' own decision about whether to continue westward. They turned back. The most credible explanation among historians involves the death of the great Khan Ogedai in December of 1241, which required the senior Mongol commanders to return east for the succession process. Europe's survival owed more to Mongol internal politics than to European military resistance. Europe did not know this at the time, and that ignorance shaped what came next in ways that would echo for centuries. What came next was fear. Fear on a scale that European civilization had not experienced since the early centuries of the Common Era. And fear, when it is large enough and sustained enough, does not produce clear thinking. It produces documents, and the documents it produced in the months and years after April of 1241 were not records of what the Mongol world actually was. They were records of what European civilization was afraid of. The word Tartar became the container for that fear. Its folk etymology, connecting the name to Tartarus, the Greek underworld, was already circulating in European learned culture before the invasions, and the events of 1241 made it irresistible. The invaders became, in European imagination, literally, the people of hell, a divine punishment sent upon a sinful Christendom rather than a military and political civilization that deserved to be understood on its own terms. That theological reframing had practical consequences. If the Tartars were the people of hell, the appropriate response was prayer and repentance, rather than serious strategic analysis. The careful diplomatic and military intelligence that a realistic assessment of the Mongol threat would have required never developed in the way it should have, because the dominant cultural framework made intelligence gathering feel secondary to spiritual response. The word Tartar came to label not just the Mongols who had actually attacked Europe, but everything east of the known European world that was not China and not India. It was applied to peoples who were ethnically, linguistically, culturally, and politically entirely distinct from the Mongols. It was applied to Turks and Tungusic peoples, and Siberian hunter-gatherers and Central Asian oasis farmers with equal indiscrimination. The word became, in European usage, a way of saying that a people came from the direction of the catastrophe. That was its primary meaning. Everything else it supposedly described was secondary to that geographic and emotional association. The Mongol Empire itself deserves a clearer description than European cartography ever gave it. At its greatest extent, reached within a few decades of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, it was the largest contiguous land empire in the history of human civilization by area. It stretched from the Pacific coast of Asia to the borders of Poland and Hungary in the west, from Siberia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. Genghis Khan, born around 1162 in what is now Mongolia under the name Temujin, unified the Mongol and Turkic tribes of the eastern steppe through a combination of military genius, political innovation, and ruthless elimination of rival power centers. The decimal organization of Mongol armies, the merit-based promotion system that allowed talented subordinates to rise regardless of their tribal origin. The law code, known as the Yasa, that represented a significant institutional consolidation within the steppe tradition. These were genuine achievements that had no equivalent in the political structures European cartography was equipped to recognize. The empire that Genghis Khan and his successors built created what historians call the Pax Mongolica, a period during which the suppression of banditry and the establishment of imperial relay stations and trade protections across the steppe made long-distance commerce safer and more reliable than it had been in centuries. The journey of Marco Polo from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan in China, which began in 1271, was possible because of the infrastructure the Mongol Empire had created and maintained. The movement of plague bacteria from Central Asia to Europe along trade routes in the 1340s, which produced the Black Death, was also facilitated by Mongol-era connectivity. European cartography gave this world historical entity the label Tartaria. The mismatch is extraordinary when stated plainly. An empire whose scale had no precedent in human history was, in European geographic vocabulary, an undifferentiated zone of vague menace assigned a name derived from the classical underworld. The sophisticated political, military, and commercial structures that organized life across half the Eurasian continent were invisible behind a label designed not to describe them, but to contain the anxiety they provoked. The historian Peter Jackson, whose work on the Mongols and the West remains one of the most thorough examinations of how European civilization processed its encounter with the Mongol Empire, argues that the fundamental problem was not simply lack of information. Information was available. The problem was that European civilization lacked the intellectual infrastructure to integrate what it learned about the Mongol world into any framework that would have allowed it to see that world clearly. The space was real. The gap was real. What filled it was not a hidden empire. What filled it was a world that European civilization never learned to describe clearly enough to see. The label said Tartaria. Underneath it, history kept happening. In the autumn of 1247, a 60-year-old Franciscan friar named Giovanni de Pien del Carpine arrived back in Lyon after one of the longest journeys any Western European had made in living memory. He had left the previous year on a papal diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, crossing Poland and Russia, the Dnieper River, and the open steppe, covering thousands of miles on horseback in both directions. He had spent months at the court of the great Khan Guyuk in Mongolia. He had received the Khan's formal response to the Pope's letter, essentially a demand that all Western rulers submit to Mongol authority. And he had made it back alive. He was carrying something more valuable than the Khan's reply. He was carrying first-hand knowledge of the Mongol world, gathered over months of careful observation at the center of the largest empire in human history. And in the weeks after his return, as church officials reviewed his mission and assessed its diplomatic results, a question went largely unasked. Not what the Khan had said. That part everyone wanted to know. But what the Mongol world was actually like. How it was organized. Why it had defeated every army it had encountered. What its internal political structures looked like. What a realistic European response might involve. The institutions that received his report were not designed to ask those questions, because they had already decided, in the months after 1241, what the Mongols were, and what they had decided was not a political or military assessment. It was a theological one. Matthew Paris, an English Benedictine monk at St. Albans who died in 1259, assembled reports from across the continent for his Chronica Majora. He had never been to Asia. He had never met a Mongol. His information came through chains of report and rumor, stretching across thousands of miles and passing through multiple languages. Each transmission introducing new distortions. The picture he assembled was monstrous. The invaders drink blood and eat the flesh of the dead. They are physically deformed. They come from a land so terrible that even the name of it, Tartaria, carries the resonance of the classical underworld. Matthew Paris was not lying. He was doing what people do with an experience too large and too unexpected to integrate into existing frameworks. He reached for the most extreme categories available and applied them to the thing he could not comprehend. There is a letter, preserved in Matthew Paris's chronicle, sent by a French cleric traveling in Germany to the Archbishop of Bordeaux, purporting to describe the Mongol forces based on the testimony of a Hungarian bishop. The Mongols described in the letter have nothing to do with the Mongols who actually fought in 1241. They are assembled from the most extreme available vocabulary of demonization. The letter was taken seriously. It was copied and distributed. It contributed to the European picture of the Eastern world that would persist for centuries. By connecting the invaders to the classical underworld, European chroniclers were placing the Mongol invasion within a theological framework that made it interpretable. If the Tatars were literally the people of hell, then their appearance was a divine punishment. And if it was a divine punishment, then the appropriate response was prayer and repentance, rather than serious strategic analysis of why European cavalry had been systematically destroyed by an enemy they did not understand. Giovanni's report, the Historia Mongolorum, was the antidote that the patient refused to take. It contains careful, specific, first-hand observations of Mongol society, military organization, political structure, and religious practice. He had actual access to people who knew the Mongol world from the inside. His description of Mongol military methods is detailed enough that military historians have found it useful centuries later. His observations about the diversity of religious traditions at the Mongol court, where Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and shamanists all had a presence, convey something genuine about the cosmopolitanism of a civilization that European imagination had turned into monsters. The Historia Mongolorum was read. It was copied. It circulated in European ecclesiastical networks. And Matthew Paris's chronicles spread further and faster, not because one document was more visible than the other, but because the chronicle told a story that fit existing fears, while the report told a story that required existing fears to be set aside. The demonizing vocabulary was too useful. The framework that made the Mongols legible as the people of hell was more psychologically manageable than the framework that made them legible as an extraordinarily capable civilization that European thinking needed to engage with seriously. This is the mechanism this chapter has been tracing. And it is worth stating plainly. Misinformation does not always spread because it is deliberately false. It spreads because it is emotionally useful. The stories European civilization told about Tartaria after 1241 were intended to make an unbearable experience bearable by placing it within a familiar framework of meaning. The deception was a byproduct of the emotional need, not its purpose, but the consequence was a deception nonetheless. A real civilization, with sophisticated political structures and cultural traditions and cities of genuine scale, was systematically misrepresented in European consciousness for centuries. The misrepresentation was not organized. It had no center and no coordinator. It emerged from the accumulated weight of documents like Matthew Paris's Chronicle, each one repeating and amplifying the emotional inheritance of the previous one. None of them asking whether the picture they were painting had any relationship to the world they claimed to describe. The label Tartaria was the deposit that this process left on European maps. It marked the place where Europe's fear had settled, where the trauma of 1241 had crystallized into a geographic category. Everything that was actually in that space had to fit itself under a label designed not to describe it, but to contain the anxiety it provoked. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine filed his report and returned to ecclesiastical duties. He was later made Archbishop of Antivari, a position he held until his death in 1252. His Historia Mongolorum survived. It was eventually published and is now available in scholarly editions. His observations about Mongol military tactics, political organization, and cultural practice are cited in modern academic work on the Mongol Empire. It took roughly 700 years for the right institutions to exist, to ask the right questions of what he brought back. That is not a minor footnote to the history of knowledge. That is the history of knowledge. There is a place in the Volga steppe of southern Russia, roughly 80 kilometers from the city of Astrakhan, where the ground holds something that European cartography never suspected. The site is called Sarai Batu. It sits on a low rise above the floodplain of the Aktuba River, a distributary of the Volga, in a landscape that is flat in every direction to the horizon. There is nothing dramatic about the setting. The steppe here is dry and windswept, and to a visitor accustomed to the kind of landscape that European civilization associates with historical significance, completely unremarkable. Below the surface is a city, not a village, not a fortified camp, a city. Russian and international archaeological teams working at the site since the 1950s, with renewed intensity from the early 2000s onward, have uncovered the remains of an urban center that, depending on how archaeologists define the full extent of the urban zone, covered somewhere between 30 and 40 square kilometers at its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. Some archaeological estimates place its population at between 75,000 and 100,000 people. Though these figures continue to be refined as excavation continues and methodologies improve, Sarai Batu was the first capital of the Golden Horde, the western successor state of the Mongol Empire that controlled the Pontic and Caspian steppe from the mid-13th century until its fragmentation in the 15th. At its height, the city had mosques, Christian churches of multiple denominations, Buddhist temples, a palace complex, craft workshops producing ceramics, metalwork, and glass, a water supply system with fired clay pipes running under the streets, and neighborhoods distinguished by the ethnic and religious backgrounds of their inhabitants: Mongol, Kipchak, Russian, Armenian, Khanusa. European cartographers of the 13th and 14th centuries knew Sarai existed. The city appears in the accounts of several travelers who passed through it. The Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta, who visited around 1332 to 1333, described it as one of the finest cities he had encountered in his extraordinarily extensive travels across the known world. What European cartographers did not do was let this knowledge change the label they applied to the region. Sarai was in Tartaria. A city of tens of thousands of people was in Tartaria. The mosques and churches and Buddhist temples and palace complex were all in Tartaria. The label remained, undisturbed by the urban reality it was supposed to describe. Sarai Batu is not the only city that makes this point. It is simply one of the most archaeologically accessible. Karakorum, the first imperial capital of the Mongol Empire, built by Ogedei Khan in the 1230s in what is now central Mongolia, was described by William of Rubruck, who visited it in 1254, as a city with two main streets, 12 temples of various religious traditions, 2 mosques, and a Nestorian Christian church. Archaeological excavation at Karakorum, carried out by German and Mongolian teams in the 1990s and continuing into the present, has confirmed and extended Rubruck's account. The city had a formal urban plan, a palace complex with floor heating, craft quarters producing items in metal, bone, and ceramic, and evidence of a sophisticated water management system. Samarkand requires a longer description because its history extends far beyond the Mongol period, though the Mongol conquest of 1220 is part of its story. The city had been a significant urban center for over 1,000 years before the Mongols arrived. Under Timur, known in European sources as Tamerlane, in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Samarkand became the capital of an empire and was rebuilt on a scale that made it one of the most architecturally significant cities in the world. The Registan, the great public square surrounded by madrasas whose facades are covered in tile work of extraordinary sophistication, stands today as one of the most visited architectural sites in Central Asia. The craftsmen who built it were not nomads. The scholars who taught in its madrasas were not barbarians. The destruction of Urgench by Mongol forces in 1221 is worth dwelling on, because it represents something that the nomad narrative about the steppe world consistently obscures. The Mongol campaigns through Central Asia in the early 13th century were among the most destructive military operations in pre-modern history. Cities that had been accumulating urban infrastructure, scholarly institutions, and commercial networks for centuries were reduced to rubble in campaigns that lasted months. The historian Ibn al-Athir, writing around 1230, described the Mongol campaigns as a catastrophe, the like of which the world had never seen. He was describing something that genuinely had no precedent in the recorded experience of the Islamic world: the systematic destruction of a dozen major urban centers within the span of a few years. This is a dimension of the steppe world's history that both major traditions of discussing Tartaria consistently ignore. The conspiracy tradition that insists Tartaria was a great civilization tends to romanticize the steppe world, without engaging with its genuine violence. The dismissive tradition that treats Tartaria as simply an empty label tends to skip over the urban and intellectual achievements of the steppe-adjacent world. Both traditions are selecting the parts of the evidence that support the narrative they prefer. The full picture is considerably more complex than either tradition acknowledges. The steppe world produced Karakorum and Sarai, and Samarkand and Bukhara. It also produced the campaigns that destroyed Urgench and Nishapur and Merv. It produced the Pax Mongolica, a century of relative stability that made long-distance trade safer than it had been in generations. It also produced the plague connectivity that sent the Black Death sweeping across Eurasia. It produced courts of remarkable cosmopolitan sophistication, where scholars and craftsmen and religious figures of many traditions worked alongside each other. It also produced military campaigns of extraordinary brutality. The steppe world was fully human. It had the full range of human capacities: creative, destructive, sophisticated, brutal, generous, catastrophic. What it was not was primitive. What it was not was empty. The archaeological evidence is particularly important here because it speaks directly to the question of urban civilization in a way that written sources alone cannot. The fired clay pipes under the streets of Sarai Batu, the floor heating system in the palace at Karakorum, the massive storage facilities and craft workshops at multiple steppe sites, The trade goods of Chinese, Iranian, Byzantine, and European origin found at urban centers throughout the region. These are not the artifacts of a primitive culture. They are the artifacts of a civilization with the organizational capacity to supply large urban populations with water and heat, to coordinate the production of specialized craft goods, and to maintain the commercial networks that brought luxury items from every corner of Eurasia into a single marketplace. Linda Komarov, whose scholarly work on the art and material culture of the Mongol period has been central to the revaluation of this era's achievements, has argued that the Mongol courts of the 13th and 14th centuries were among the most significant centers of artistic patronage and cultural exchange in the medieval world. The movement of craftsmen, scholars, and artistic traditions across the Mongol Empire produced cultural syntheses that would have been impossible without the political infrastructure the empire provided. None of this is visible in the word Tartaria. The people who lived in the space that European maps labeled Tartaria built cities of tens of thousands of people. They produced medical encyclopedias that shaped European medicine for 5 centuries. They created architectural monuments that still draw visitors from around the world. They maintained trade networks that connected Chinese silk workshops to European aristocratic markets. They developed artistic traditions of genuine sophistication. They built legal and administrative systems that organized the lives of tens of millions of people across the largest contiguous territory that any political system in human history had ever controlled. The label Tartaria described none of this. It could not describe any of it, because it was designed not to describe but to dismiss, not to reveal but to contain. Sarai Batu sits above the Aktuba River, 80 kilometers from Astrakhan, in a landscape that is flat in every direction to the horizon. Below the surface is a city that tens of thousands of people called home. The cartographers called it Tartaria and moved on. The city stayed where it was, doing what cities do, holding its ground, holding its people, holding its history in the dirt, waiting for someone to come and look. In the autumn of 1552, Ivan IV of Russia rode into the city of Kazan at the head of an army that had just spent weeks reducing its walls with artillery and undermining its foundations with tunnels packed with gunpowder. The siege of Kazan was not simply a military campaign. It was the moment when the Russian state crossed a threshold that would define the next 3 centuries of its history. Kazan was the capital of the Kazan Khanate, one of the successor states that had emerged from the fragmentation of the Golden Horde in the 15th century. It was a city of mosques and minarets, of scholars and merchants, of a Muslim Tatar population that had been living in the Middle Volga region for centuries. Taking it meant that Russia was no longer simply defending itself against steppe power. Russia was becoming an absorbing power, incorporating rather than resisting the world that European maps called Tartaria. The consequences of that shift took generations to fully manifest, but they began immediately. In the practical problem that faced every Russian administrator who sat down to govern the territories the expanding state was consuming. What do you call the place you have just conquered? This is not a trivial question. Names are administrative tools. They determine which legal frameworks apply, which tax categories are relevant, which military jurisdictions have authority, which ecclesiastical structures have responsibility. A territory without a proper name in the Russian imperial system was a territory that the system could not process. And the territories Russia was absorbing through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were territories that existing Russian administrative vocabulary was not designed to handle. The Kazan Khanate became, after 1552, a Russian administrative unit, but its population was not Russian. Its religious tradition was not Orthodox Christian. Its legal customs were not derived from Russian law, and its geography was not organized around the river systems and forest zones that Russian administrative thinking had developed to manage. The administrators sent from Moscow to govern it were dealing with a world that their training had not prepared them for. Astrakhan fell in 1556, 4 years after Kazan, the Astrakhan Khanate, at the mouth of the Volga where the river meets the Caspian Sea, was a commercial center of considerable importance, sitting at the intersection of Russian, Persian, Central Asian, and Caucasian trade routes. Its absorption gave Russia control of the entire Volga from its northern forests to the Caspian, a geographic achievement of enormous strategic and commercial significance. It also gave Russia a new administrative problem of the same kind, a diverse population of Tatars, Nogai, Kalmuks, and various other peoples who did not fit existing Russian administrative categories. What the Russian state developed over the following 2 centuries was not a single coherent policy, but a set of pragmatic adaptations, varying by region and by the political and military circumstances of each absorption. Local elites in conquered territories were sometimes incorporated into the Russian nobility. Local legal customs were sometimes preserved alongside Russian law. Local religious institutions were sometimes tolerated and sometimes suppressed, depending on the calculations of particular rulers and particular moments. The word Tartaria, in this context, was not a Russian word. It was a European word, used on European maps to describe regions that Russian administrators were dealing with in much more specific terms. Russian documents of the 16th and 17th centuries did not use Tartaria as an administrative category. They used specific names for specific places: the Kazan region, the Astrakhan region, Siberia, the steppe. Each name corresponded to a specific administrative challenge, a specific population, a specific set of governing problems. The gap between European cartographic vocabulary and Russian administrative vocabulary is important for understanding why Tartaria disappeared when it did and how it disappeared. European maps continued to label Russian-absorbed territories as Tartaria long after those territories had been incorporated into the Russian administrative system with specific named districts. The cartographic label was not keeping up with political reality because cartographers were copying each other more than they were consulting Russian administrative documents. The expansion into Siberia deserves particular attention because it proceeded at a speed that had no real parallel in the steppe frontier experience. Russian expansion across Siberia, driven primarily by the fur trade and organized around a network of fortified trading posts, moved from the Urals to the Pacific in roughly 60 years, from the 1580s to the 1640s. By 1649, Russian state representatives had reached the Amur River. By 1650, they were in contact with Chinese imperial forces defending the Qing dynasty's northeastern frontier. The solution the Russian state reached for in governing Siberia was yasak, a tribute system borrowed directly from the Mongol administrative tradition. Russian fur tax collectors working their way across Siberia imposed yasak obligations on local communities in patterns that the Mongol Empire would have recognized immediately. The Russian imperial state was not reinventing administrative practice from scratch. It was adapting and extending the administrative inheritance of the steppe world it was consuming. This is one of the ironies that runs through the entire story of Tartaria, the Russian Empire that absorbed the steppe world, and whose expansion contributed to the eventual disappearance of the Tartaria label from European maps, was itself significantly shaped by its encounter with that world. Russian military organization, administrative practice, and diplomatic tradition all bore marks of the long interaction with steppe civilizations that preceded the period of Russian expansion. Michael Khodorkovsky, whose work on Russia's steppe frontier remains one of the most thorough examinations of how the Russian state absorbed the steppe world, argues that the process was neither simple conquest nor simple assimilation. It was a prolonged and complicated negotiation, conducted differently in different regions and at different times, between a centralizing imperial state and the diverse populations it was incorporating. Some of those populations resisted, some accommodated, some were destroyed, some survived with significant elements of their previous social organization intact. Andreas Koppeler, whose scholarship on the Russian Empire as a multi-ethnic state has been central to the modern understanding of Russian imperial history, argues that the Russian approach to governing non-Russian peoples was considerably more varied and more pragmatic than either the Russian nationalist tradition or its Soviet successor preferred to acknowledge. The empire incorporated Muslims and Buddhists and animists and Orthodox Christians, settled farmers and nomadic pastoralists and forest hunters. It managed this diversity not through a single coherent policy of assimilation but through a patchwork of specific accommodations, each calibrated to the particular population and the particular moment. But the accommodation was never equal. The Russian imperial center set the terms. The absorbed peoples negotiated within those terms, not on terms of their own choosing. The administrative vocabulary that replaced Tartaria was a Russian vocabulary. The categories that replaced the European geographic label were Russian imperial categories. The peoples who had lived under the label Tartaria now lived under labels assigned by a power that had conquered them. And the difference between those labels and the names those peoples used for themselves was, in many cases, very large. Tartaria did not disappear because it was erased. It disappeared because the organizational logic that had made a single label convenient for European observers was replaced by a different organizational logic, one based on Russian imperial administration rather than European geographic imagination. Ivan IV rode into Kazan in 1552 and found a city of mosques and scholars and merchants, the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Theotokos, known popularly as St. Basil's Cathedral. Its name derived not from Ivan's intention, but from a holy fool named Vasily, who was buried nearby, and whom the people of Moscow came to venerate. Was commissioned to commemorate the conquest. It still stands on Red Square as one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. The cathedral commemorates a conquest. What it commemorates the conquest of is less visible from Moscow than the cathedral itself. Consider what it took to produce a map of Asia in 17th century Amsterdam. You did not travel to Asia. You gathered documents. You ordered the published atlases of your predecessors. The diplomatic reports circulating through merchant networks, the accounts of missionaries who had spent years in China or Japan or the Mongol court, and whatever geographic descriptions had made their way back through the channels of European commerce and diplomacy. You spread these documents across your work table, compared them, noted their contradictions, and tried to synthesize from them something that looked like a coherent picture of a continent most of your readers would never see. For the coasts, this process worked reasonably well. European trading companies had strong commercial incentives to produce accurate charts of the coastlines where their ships needed to navigate, and decades of maritime experience had produced a body of coastal cartography that was, by the 17th century, genuinely reliable for the major trading routes. A merchant in Amsterdam, who wanted to know the depth of a harbor in Goa or the position of a reef off Malacca, could find reasonably accurate information. For the interior of Asia, the process produced something different. The sources were sparse, old, and filtered through layers of transmission that introduced compounding distortions. The political structures that organized life in the interior changed faster than documents reporting on them could travel to Amsterdam and be published. The languages in which the most accurate information existed, Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Mongolian, were largely unread by European cartographers, and the commercial motivation that drove the careful accuracy of coastal charts was simply absent for regions where European trade had no direct presence. The Tartaria label persisted on European maps in this environment, not because cartographers believed it was accurate, but because it was the best available substitute for knowledge they did not have. A blank space on a map was an admission of failure. A label was a solution, however inadequate, and the label that had been on the previous generation's map was the easiest label to inherit. J. B. Harley, the historian of cartography, whose work fundamentally changed how scholars think about the relationship between maps and power, argued, in his posthumously published collection, The New Nature of Maps, that this kind of inherited, placeholder knowledge is never politically neutral. A map that covers a vast territory with a single label is making a statement about what deserves to be known and what does not. The detailed work that went into charting European coastlines and commercially important Asian ports was not matched by comparable effort for the interior of Asia. And that disproportion reflected a set of institutional priorities about whose geography mattered. Nicolaas Witsen, the Dutch diplomat and cartographer, who spent decades assembling a comprehensive geographic description of northern and eastern Asia, published his major work, Noord en Oost Tartaria, in Amsterdam in 1692. Witsen was genuinely trying to do better than his predecessors. He corresponded with Russian officials and Dutch merchants with direct experience of Siberia and Central Asia. He assembled a quantity of specific information about the region that significantly exceeded what any previous European scholar had compiled. His text is full of detail about specific peoples, places, and political structures, and yet he organized all of that detail under the label Tartaria, not because he was unaware of the region's complexity, but because the label was the organizing framework that European geographic tradition had established for the region. And replacing it required not just more information, but a different way of thinking about what geographic description was supposed to accomplish. Witsen had the information to break the habit. He did not have the framework. The French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville, working in Paris in the mid-18th century, came closest among European cartographers to that different framework. D'Anville engaged seriously with Chinese geographic sources through the Jesuit cartographic tradition, and he used those sources to produce maps of Inner Asia more accurate than anything his predecessors had achieved. His maps subdivided the former Tartaria label into more specific regional designations, using Chinese and Manchu geographic names for regions within the Qing sphere of influence, distinguishing between territories under Russian administration and territories organized under their own political structures. But even d'Anville could not fully escape the Tartaria framework. The label appears on his maps, reduced and more specifically defined, but still present, still organizing space in terms derived from European tradition rather than from the traditions of the peoples who lived there. Matthew Edney, whose work, Mapping an Empire, examines the role of cartography in British imperial expansion, has argued that the development of systematic scientific surveying in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was driven primarily by imperial administrative need. The British surveyed India because they needed accurate geographic information to govern it. The Russians surveyed Siberia and Central Asia for the same reason. Accurate maps followed the need to administer territory, not simply the desire to know it. The Tartaria label survived as long as it did, partly because no European state had both the knowledge and the administrative need to replace it simultaneously. When Russia and Britain developed sufficient presence in Central Asia to require accurate geographic information for governing purposes, the label became inadequate and was replaced quickly. Maps do not update when reality changes. They update when the people who make maps have a reason to care about accuracy. For Inner Asia, that reason arrived in the early 19th century, 200 years after it should have. Open any volume of the encyclopedia, and what strikes you first is the confidence. Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert launched their great project in 1751 with an ambition that was itself a philosophical statement: to compile the sum of human knowledge in a form accessible to any educated reader, to make the entire inheritance of human learning available rather than locked in the hands of specialists and institutions. The project would eventually fill 28 volumes, involve hundreds of contributors, be banned by the French Royal Council, condemned by the Pope, celebrated by Voltaire, and read by every serious intellectual from Edinburgh to St. Petersburg. It became the defining document of the French Enlightenment. It also contained an entry on Tartary that, read carefully, reveals exactly how the most ambitious knowledge project of the 18th century handled the problem of describing something it had never seen. The entry was attributed primarily to Louis de Jaucourt, one of the most prolific contributors to the encyclopedia. A physician and polymath who wrote thousands of entries across an extraordinary range of subjects. His approach to Tartary was the approach a thorough European scholar of his era would have taken. Gather the best available European sources, synthesize them, and present the result with the confidence that the encyclopedia's format demanded. His sources were the accumulated European geographic tradition, earlier encyclopedias, travel accounts, the cartographic descriptions of Sanson and Delisle, the diplomatic and missionary reports that had been circulating in European learned culture for 2 centuries. The information was the best European scholarship had to offer. The problem was that the best European scholarship had to offer was, for this particular subject, 2 centuries out of date, filtered through translations and transmissions that had introduced compounding distortions, and missing entirely the documentary traditions that would have provided a more accurate picture. The entry opens with confidence. Tartaria, we are told, is an immense region of Asia and Europe, bounded to the north by the Frozen Sea, to the east by China and the Eastern Sea, to the south by China, India, Persia, and the Caspian Sea, and to the west by Russia and the Ural Mountains. 4 subdivisions follow: Grand Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, and Little Tartary. Now, consider what was actually happening in the territories described by those subdivisions. In 1751, the year the entry was published, the Kazakh steppe, which Jaucourt would have included in Independent Tartary, was living through one of the most catastrophic periods in its history. The Dzungar Khanate, a Mongol Buddhist confederation, had been raiding and conquering Kazakh territories since the late 17th century, the period known in Kazakh historical memory as Akhtaban Shubirindi. The Great Disaster saw significant portions of the Kazakh population displaced, killed, or forced to seek Russian protection, with the worst violence concentrated roughly in the 1720s, though conflict continued for years afterward. By the 1750s, the Dzungar Khanate was itself being systematically destroyed by the Qing dynasty of China in a campaign that historians now recognize as one of the most severe demographic collapses of the 18th century anywhere in the world. None of this appears in the entry on Tartary. The entry describes the peoples of the region in terms that European sources had been applying for centuries: nomads, herders, tribal chiefs. The description is not entirely wrong, but it describes a static world, a world without history, without change, without the political drama and human suffering that was actually occurring in the region at the moment the entry was being written. Robert Darnton, whose work on the encyclopedia and the French book trade of the 18th century has been fundamental to understanding how the project worked in practice, argues that the encyclopedia's real significance was not the accuracy of its individual entries, but the model of knowledge it embodied: systematic, rational, comprehensive, presented with a confidence that signaled authority, regardless of the quality of the underlying sources. That confidence was the problem. An encyclopedia entry that begins with authoritative geographic definition and proceeds through systematic description communicates expertise, whether or not the underlying information merits it. The form of the encyclopedia was impeccable. The content, for regions outside European knowledge, was an organized version of the same ignorance that had been circulating for generations. What the encyclopedia did was take that ignorance and dress it in the most authoritative intellectual format the 18th century could produce. Philip Blum, whose history of the encyclopedia traces the project from its origins through its completion, notes that D'Alembert acknowledged in his preliminary discourse that the work was incomplete and that future editions would correct errors and fill gaps. But the acknowledgement of incompleteness was a rhetorical gesture. Specific entries, including the entry on Tartary, made no such acknowledgement. They presented their material with the full authority of the encyclopedias format, and that format communicated certainty. The entry was published. It was cited by subsequent geographic writers. It fed into the next generation's understanding of the region. The chain of confident ignorance extended forward in time, each link strengthened by the authority of the previous one. There is something almost clarifying about reading the encyclopedia entry on Tartary alongside the historical record of what was actually happening in those territories in 1751. The entry radiates order. The historical record reveals catastrophe, population collapse in the Kazakh steppe, the systematic destruction of the Dzungar state, tens of thousands of people dying in a conflict that the encyclopedia could not see because it was not in any of the sources Jacques was reading. The entry was not a lie. It was something more interesting and more instructive than a lie. It was the shape of a civilization's knowledge about itself, pressed against the shape of what it did not know. The confidence filled the space. The space was full of history. The history was invisible behind the confidence. That gap between what the encyclopedia knew and what was actually happening is not a minor historical footnote. It is the shape of the problem this investigation has been tracing since the first chapter. And it did not end with the encyclopedia. It continued forward through time, shaping every subsequent European attempt to understand the world that Tartaria labeled, until the intellectual and political conditions of the 19th century finally created enough pressure to replace the label with something more accurate. By then, a great deal of history had happened in the space. The entry described as static. Lion. Autumn of 1247. A 60-year-old Franciscan friar named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine has just returned from the longest journey any Western European had made in living memory. And the institutions waiting to receive his report were asking the wrong questions. Not wrong in the sense of malicious, wrong in the sense of structurally predetermined. The papal curia that had commissioned his mission to the Mongol court had a specific set of questions it needed answered. Were the Mongols open to Christian conversion? Had the Khan received the Pope's letter with appropriate respect? Was there any diplomatic opening to pursue? Giovanni had answers to all of these questions. The Khan had received the letter. The response was essentially a demand for universal submission. No diplomatic opening existed. These answers were noted, assessed, and filed. The mission had failed in its stated purpose. The meeting had happened. The reply had been delivered. The record was complete. What was not complete, and what the institutional framework that received Giovanni's report was not designed to process, was everything else he had brought back. His report, the Historia Mongolorum, is specific in ways that contemporary European accounts of the Mongol world almost never are. He describes the political succession process at the Mongol court with enough accuracy that it can be verified against Mongolian and Chinese sources written entirely independently of his account. He describes the decimal organization of Mongol armies with enough precision that military historians have found it useful centuries later. He describes the diversity of religious traditions at the Mongol court. The Nestorian Christians and Buddhists and Muslims and shamanists who all had a presence there, with the kind of observational detail that comes from having actually sat in rooms with these people over a period of months. He was describing, in careful detail, a civilization that the European world had decided was simply the people of hell. His report offered a different frame. The institutions that received it were not in the market for a different frame. William of Rubruck, a Flemish friar sent by the French King Louis IX on a mission to the Mongol court in 1253, encountered the same structural problem from a different angle. Rubruck was, by any reasonable assessment, an exceptionally skilled observer. His account of Karakorum, the Mongol imperial capital, is the most specific description we have of that city from any European source. He names the religious buildings. He describes the craftsmen and their products. He records conversations with Buddhist monks, Nestorian priests, and Muslim scholars. He notes the floor plan of the Great Hall where the Khan received visitors. He engages in the limited way available to someone working through interpreters with the actual intellectual traditions of the people he is meeting. He is reading him across 7 centuries, unmistakably present in the rooms he describes. The French court that received his report was interested in one question. Was there a possibility of Mongol alliance against Islamic powers blocking European access to the Holy Land? Rubruck's assessment was that such an alliance was unlikely and that the Mongols were not reliable partners for this purpose. This was the politically relevant finding, the 11 chapters he devoted to Karakoram's layout, its craftsmen, its religious diversity, its political ritual, its cosmopolitan populations. These were the observations of a man who had been somewhere extraordinary. They were not the answer to the question his patron had sent him to answer. This is the structural failure at the heart of the European encounter with the Mongol world. The information that the most careful European observers of the Mongol world brought back was not the information that European institutional frameworks were designed to receive. The papal curia wanted diplomatic results. The French court wanted strategic intelligence on a specific question. What Giovanni and Rubruck actually produced was something more valuable and less immediately useful. Careful observation of a civilization that was unlike anything European categories had been designed to describe. Marco Polo is the case that most complicates this picture, and also the case that most clearly illustrates the deeper problem. The account of his travels, produced around 1298 in collaboration with a Romance writer named Rustichello da Pisa, became one of the most widely read texts in medieval European culture. Polo had spent roughly 17 years in Asia, beginning his journey from Venice in 1271, and had direct experience of the Mongol world that dwarfed anything Giovanni or Rubruck had encountered. Scholars continued to debate specific aspects of his account. Frances Wood, in her provocative 1995 study, Did Marco Polo Go to China?, raised questions about the nature of his first-hand experience versus possible reliance on secondary sources for portions of his narrative. The scholarly debate has not reached a definitive conclusion. What is not debated is the character of the document as European audiences received it. Rustichello was a writer of romances, and his contribution to the collaboration was precisely the narrative shaping that made the account compelling for European readers. The extraordinary, the marvelous, the things that confirmed European assumptions about the exotic character of the Eastern world. These received emphasis in the telling, the administrative, the institutional, the things that would have allowed a careful reader to understand how the Mongol world actually functioned as a political and commercial system. These received less. The result was a text that shaped European imagination about Asia for centuries, while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that the Eastern world was primarily a source of wonders, rather than a place whose civilizational structures deserved to be understood on their own terms. Igor de Rachevilts, the scholar whose work on papal envoys to the Mongol court has been fundamental to the modern understanding of these journeys, argues that the failure of European civilization to integrate the information that Giovanni and Rubruck brought back was structural rather than accidental. The institutional channels through which their accounts were processed were not designed to receive the kind of information they had produced. The consequence of that structural failure persisted long after the specific reports of Giovanni and Rubruck had been filed and forgotten. Every generation of European scholars who wrote about the Mongol world and the territories labeled Tartaria after 1247 had access, in principle, to what these travelers had reported. The manuscripts existed. The information was available to anyone who looked for it. But the dominant picture of Tartaria was not shaped by what Giovanni and Rubruck had actually observed. It was shaped by what Matthew Paris and his contemporaries had felt. And what they had felt was fear. And fear had a much stronger institutional infrastructure for its perpetuation than careful observation did. The travelers went. They looked carefully. they came back with something genuinely valuable. And the world they described was less interesting to the institutions that received their reports than the world those institutions had already decided was there. That is a particular kind of epistemic failure, not one produced by bad faith or deliberate suppression, produced by the ordinary operation of institutions asking only the questions they already knew how to ask, and receiving the answers those questions were designed to elicit. The information that did not fit the question was not destroyed. It was simply set aside, preserved in manuscripts, copied for future scholars who would, eventually, 700 years later, build the institutional frameworks to ask the questions that the manuscripts had always been capable of answering. Giovanni da Pien del Carpine returned to ecclesiastical duties after Lyon. His Historia Mongolorum survived. His observations about Mongol military tactics, political organization, and cultural practice are cited in modern academic work on the Mongol Empire. The questions his report could answer are now being asked by scholars with the training and the institutional support to receive the answers. The journey took about 700 years. That is how long it takes, sometimes, for the right questions to catch up with the available evidence. In 1817, a German geographer named Karl Ritter began publishing a work that would eventually run to 19 volumes and occupy most of his professional life. Die Erdkunde, a systematic geographic description of the Asian and African continents, represented something genuinely new in the European tradition, an attempt to understand the physical and human geography of regions through systematic observation and comparative analysis rather than through the compilation of earlier sources. In Ritter's work, the word Tartaria does not organize the Asian interior. The regions that earlier European geographers had covered with that single label appear in Ritter's treatment as distinct geographic and cultural zones, each with its own physical characteristics, its own peoples, its own history. Central Asia is not Tartaria. Siberia is not Tartaria. Mongolia is not Tartaria. Each has a name that corresponds to something real about the place it describes, derived from the geographic, linguistic, and historical research that had been accumulating since the late 18th century. The disappearance of Tartaria from serious European geographic writing in the first half of the 19th century was not a dramatic event. No proclamation was issued. No committee decided that the word was to be retired. The label simply became increasingly impossible to use in the context of a geographic tradition that was developing more precise and more empirically grounded ways of describing the regions it had previously covered with a single vague term. Understanding why requires understanding three forces that converged in the early 19th century, each of which independently would have put pressure on the old label, and together produced its effective elimination from serious geographic usage within a generation. The first force was the development of systematic scientific geography as a discipline. Karl Ritter and his contemporary Alexander von Humboldt were not simply better cartographers than their predecessors. They represented a fundamental shift in what geographic knowledge was supposed to look like and how it was supposed to be produced. For Humboldt, geographic description meant personal observation, quantitative measurement, and the integration of physical, biological, and human data into a unified picture of a region's character. For Ritter, it meant comparative historical analysis of how physical geography shaped human civilization over time. Both approaches demanded specificity that a label like Tartaria was constitutionally incapable of providing. A geographic tradition that demanded specific altitude measurements, specific rainfall data, specific observations of vegetation, zones, and river systems could not operate with a label that covered 5,000 miles of varied terrain with a single word. The Tartaria label was not just vague. From the perspective of the emerging scientific tradition, it was epistemologically dishonest, a claim to knowledge that was actually an admission of ignorance dressed in the clothes of description. As scientific geography established itself in European universities and learned societies through the early 19th century, the standards it established made the old geographic vocabulary increasingly untenable. Young geographers trained in the new tradition did not use Tartaria because their training had given them more specific and more verifiable terms for the regions it had covered, and because using the old label would have marked them as practitioners of an outdated and discredited approach. The second force was Russian imperial expansion and the geographic knowledge it generated. By the early 19th century, the Russian Empire had been governing Siberia for nearly 2 centuries, and the Kazakh steppe for several decades. The administrative needs of governing these territories had driven the production of geographic surveys, population censuses, administrative reports, and ethnographic studies of a kind and quality that simply had not existed for the region before Russian imperial penetration. Russian geographic knowledge of Inner Asia in the early 19th century was, by a considerable margin, more detailed and more accurate than anything available in Western Europe. Russian surveyors had mapped river systems. Russian administrators had documented populations, languages, and economic activities. Russian scholars had begun the systematic study of the languages and histories of the peoples of Siberia and Central Asia. The specific regional vocabulary that Russian administration had developed entered European geographic usage, not as replacements consciously chosen over Tartaria, but as more precise alternatives that carried the authority of administrative reality. When a European geographer could refer to the Kazakh steppe with a name that corresponded to an actual people living in an actual geographic zone that Russian surveys had documented, using the name Tartaria for the same space felt increasingly like a choice to be less accurate rather than more. The third force was the development of European nationalism and its transformation of geographic thinking. The early 19th century was the era in which the idea that political territories should correspond to ethno-linguistic communities began to reshape European political geography. The new nationalist geography needed precise ethnic and linguistic categories. It needed to know who lived where, what languages they spoke, how they were related to neighboring peoples, what their historical traditions were. This kind of knowledge was incompatible with a label like Tartaria, which flattened the enormous ethnic and linguistic diversity of Inner Asia into a single, undifferentiated category. The development of comparative linguistics in the early 19th century was particularly important here. Scholars were establishing that the languages of Inner Asia, Turkic, Mongolian, Tungusic, Tibetan, Iranian, were distinct families with their own internal structures and their own histories. These linguistic distinctions made the ethnic and political diversity of the region legible in a new way, replacing the single label with a complex of specific categories derived from the actual linguistic and cultural geography of the region. Orlando Figes, whose work on Russian history and culture has examined the relationship between Russian imperial expansion and European geographic imagination, has argued that the 19th century transformation of European geographic vocabulary for Inner Asia was not simply a matter of better information producing more accurate maps. It was a transformation driven by changing political needs and changing intellectual frameworks, each of which demanded more specific knowledge of a region that was becoming increasingly important to European geopolitical calculations. The strategic competition between the Russian Empire and the British Empire for influence in Central Asia that dominated the foreign policy calculations of both powers through most of the 19th century. The conflict historians call the Great Game was a contest that required precise geographic knowledge of the territories at stake. British and Russian military and diplomatic planners needed to know specific mountain passes, specific river crossings, specific cities and their populations. Tartaria was useless for this purpose. Susan Leighton, whose research on Russian literature and the frontier examines how Russian writers and intellectuals processed the experience of imperial expansion, has noted that the disappearance of Tartaria from geographic vocabulary coincided with the development of new literary and cultural frameworks for understanding the peoples of the steppe. Russian writers of the 19th century engaged with the peoples of the Caucasus and the steppe in ways that acknowledged their specific cultural identities, even when those engagements were shaped by the condescension of imperial culture. The peoples of the steppe were no longer Tartars in the most serious Russian cultural engagement with them. They were Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Uzbeks and Bashkirs, peoples with specific histories and specific cultural identities. By 1880, serious European geographic writing had largely abandoned Tartaria. The label continued to appear in popular usage and in historical references for some decades longer, but as a term of art in the discipline of geography, it was effectively gone. What died with the label was not a place. The regions it had covered continued to exist. The peoples who lived in those regions continued to live there. Their histories, their cultures, their languages, their political traditions. All of this continued, largely invisible to the Western public that had spent 5 centuries using a single word to avoid learning anything specific about them. The label was retired. The world it had failed to describe kept going, and the peoples who had lived under it, who would live under new administrative vocabularies imposed by Russian, imperial, and later Soviet power, were about to enter the most difficult century of their modern history. Largely unseen by the world that had never bothered to learn their names, there is a city on the Volga River, roughly 800 kilometers east of Moscow, that has been called by different names, by different powers, at different moments in its history. The Bulgars, a Turkic people who established a state in the Middle Volga region in the 10th century of the Common Era, knew the site. The Mongols, who destroyed the Bulgar state in the 13th century, built on it. The Kazan Khanate, the successor state that emerged from the fragmentation of the Golden Horde in the 15th century, made it its capital. Ivan IV of Russia conquered it in 1552 and rebuilt it according to Russian imperial conventions. The city today is called Kazan. It is the capital of the Republic of Tatarstan, a federal subject of the Russian Federation. Its population of just over 1 million people includes a substantial proportion who identify as Kazan Tatars, descendants of the people who lived in and around the Kazan Khanate before the Russian conquest. The Tatar language is co-official with Russian in the Republic. Tatar cultural institutions, a national theater, a university with programs in Tatar language and literature, mosques rebuilt after Soviet-era destruction, function alongside their Russian language equivalents. This city, and the people who have called it home across nearly 1,000 years, is where any serious discussion of what happened to the peoples of Tartaria has to begin, because the peoples of the territories that European maps labeled Tartaria did not disappear when the label disappeared. They continued to exist. They continue to exist today, and their history over the past 4 centuries is a history that the debates about Tartaria in European geographic tradition and in 21st century internet culture almost entirely ignore. That ignorance is not neutral. It has a cost, and the cost is paid by the people whose history is being ignored. The Tatars are not one people in the sense of a single ethno-linguistic community with a unified history and a common homeland. The label Tatar covers considerable diversity. Kazan Tatars, the largest group, are descendants of the Volga Bulgars and the various Turkic and Mongol peoples who mixed in the Middle Volga region through the medieval period. Crimean Tatars are a distinct community with their own history, their own dialect, and a homeland on the Crimean Peninsula that they inhabited for centuries before the disruptions of the modern era. Siberian Tatars are several distinct groups scattered across western Siberia. What these communities share is not a common origin in a single ancient empire. What they share is the experience of having been categorized, administered, and in various ways managed by the Russian imperial state and its Soviet successor, and the experience of carrying a name that connects them to the history this investigation has been tracing, even as that connection has been used against them as often as it has been acknowledged with respect. The Crimean Tatars are the community whose modern history most directly illustrates what it means to be a people whose homeland has been defined, redefined, conquered, and contested by powers that did not always consider their presence and their claims to be significant. The Crimean Peninsula, extending into the Black Sea from the southern edge of modern Ukraine, has been inhabited by Turkic-speaking peoples since the medieval period. The Crimean Khanate, established in the 15th century as a successor state to the Golden Horde, survived as an independent state allied with the Ottoman Empire until 1783, when Catherine the Great of Russia annexed Crimea following a military campaign that ended the Khanate's political independence. The annexation of 1783 was the beginning of a prolonged process of demographic transformation. Russian settlement of Crimea was actively encouraged by the imperial government. Crimean Tatar emigration, often under economic and social pressure, reduced the Tatar proportion of Crimea's population significantly through the 19th century. The community that remained was nevertheless substantial and maintained a distinct cultural and linguistic identity through the revolutionary upheavals of the early 20th century. Then came May of 1944. In the early hours of the 18th of May, 1944, Soviet security forces under NKVD authority began the forcible deportation of the entire Crimean Tatar population from Crimea. The operation had been ordered by Joseph Stalin, officially on the grounds that Crimean Tatars had collaborated with the German occupation forces during the Second World War. An accusation applied collectively to an entire people regardless of individual behavior or political affiliation. The deportation was conducted with extreme speed. Families were given minutes to gather what they could carry. They were loaded onto cattle cars and transported to Central Asia, primarily Uzbekistan, but also the Urals region, Siberia, and other remote parts of the Soviet Union. The journey took weeks under conditions that survivor accounts and Soviet administrative records describe consistently as extraordinarily harsh. Food and water were inadequate. Medical care was essentially absent. Soviet administrative records document approximately 190,000 Crimean Tatars deported in May of 1944. Though some historical estimates place the figure higher, estimates of the death toll in the first years following deportation vary among historians working with the available documentation, reflecting both the genuine uncertainty in the surviving records and the methodological difficulty of counting deaths that occurred across dispersed locations in administrative systems not designed for careful record-keeping. What is not uncertain is that tens of thousands of people died as a direct consequence of the deportation and the conditions of their confinement, and that the Crimean Tatar homeland was emptied of its indigenous population in a matter of days. Ukraine formally recognized the deportation as genocide in 2015. The European Parliament passed a resolution using the same term in 2015. The legal and scholarly debate about whether the deportation meets the specific definitional criteria of the United Nations Genocide Convention continues among legal scholars and historians who work with the technical requirements of international law. What is not debated is the scale of the event, the suffering it caused, or the fact that it was a deliberate act of state policy directed against a specific people on the basis of their ethnic and cultural identity. Crimean Tatars were not permitted to return to Crimea until the final years of the Soviet Union. Legal permission to return came in 1989. By that point, nearly half a century had passed. A generation and a half had grown up in Uzbekistan and Siberia and the Urals. The Crimean Peninsula had been settled by Russians and Ukrainians who occupied the homes and worked the lands from which the Tatars had been expelled. Since the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, the situation of the Crimean Tatar community has deteriorated further, with human rights organizations documenting restrictions on cultural and political institutions and the detention of community leaders and activists. The Kazakh experience is different in its specific history, but similar in its underlying dynamic. The Kazakh people, whose homeland covers the enormous steppe territory of what is now the Republic of Kazakhstan, were incorporated into the Russian imperial system in stages through the 18th century. The consequences of incorporation were severe. Russian imperial land policies in the 19th century, which opened the steppe to settler colonization, disrupted the traditional pastoral circuits and reduced the pasture available to Kazakh herds. The catastrophe came with Soviet collectivization in the early 1930s. The forced sedentarization and collectivization of Kazakh nomads was carried out with a disregard for the ecological and economic logic of nomadic pastoralism that produced a famine of extraordinary severity. Historians working with available documentation estimate that somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million Kazakhs died in the famine of 1931 through 1933, representing a devastating proportion of the total Kazakh population of the period. The uncertainty in these figures reflects the incomplete nature of the surviving records. Not doubt about whether a catastrophe occurred. The Kazakh famine is not widely known outside Kazakhstan in the community of scholars who study Soviet history. Its relative obscurity in Western historical consciousness is itself a product of the sustained failure of attention to the history of the peoples of the steppe, the same failure that produced and sustained the Tartaria label for 5 centuries. The Volga Tatars, the community centered on Kazan, have a different history again. As the people most directly descended from the population of the Kazan Khanate that Ivan IV conquered in 1552, they have lived within the Russian state for nearly 5 centuries. Their experience across those centuries has not been uniform. Periods of active suppression of Tatar cultural and religious life have alternated with periods of relative tolerance. The Soviet period brought the suppression of Islamic institutions and the interruption of the traditional Tatar educational and literary culture. The post-Soviet period has brought a partial revival of Tatar cultural institutions within the framework of the Russian Federation. Brian Glynn Williams, whose scholarship on the Crimean Tatars has been among the most thorough English-language documentation of their modern history, has argued that the story of the Crimean Tatars deserves far wider recognition than it has received in Western historical education. The deportation of 1944 was one of the largest forced population movements of the 20th century. The community's continued existence and continued advocacy for recognition of what was done to them represents a form of historical resilience that merits serious attention. That attention is largely absent from the Tartaria debates that fill internet forums and social media platforms. Those debates are, in a sense, a kind of displaced anxiety about historical gaps and erasures, a genuine intuition that something is missing from the standard Western account of the past. That intuition is not wrong. Something is missing. Many things are missing. The things that are missing are not a secret advanced empire or a suppressed historical superpower. The things that are missing are the histories of actual people. The Crimean Tatars deported in cattle cars in May of 1944. The Kazakhs, who died in the famine of the early 1930s. The Volga Tatars, who maintained their language and culture across 5 centuries of Russian governance. The Bashkirs, who fought for their autonomy through multiple uprisings. The dozens of other communities whose histories lie in the space that European maps covered with a single word. Kazan sits on the Volga, 800 kilometers east of Moscow. Its minarets and its orthodox domes rise alongside each other against the sky. Its streets are filled with people who speak both Russian and Tatar, who navigate both Russian federal culture and Tatar cultural identity, who live in a city that has been conquered and renamed and rebuilt and is still, underneath all of that, the city that the Kazan Khanate built. The people are still there. That is the most important fact in this entire investigation. And it is the fact that the Tartaria debate most consistently fails to see. There is a specific feeling that the Tartaria videos produce in their most receptive viewers. And it is worth naming precisely before anything else. It is the feeling of having discovered something, not just something interesting, but something that should have been visible all along and was not. Something that the ordinary channels of education and media had failed to deliver. It is the feeling of finally seeing what others are missing, of moving from the outside of a story to the inside of it. It is, in other words, one of the most pleasurable cognitive experiences available to a human being. The Tartaria mud flood theory, which began appearing on YouTube and related platforms in recognizable form around 2017 and grew significantly over the following 2 years, is built around that feeling. Its specific claims involve a catastrophic reset event in the mid-19th century. A great Tartarian empire deliberately destroyed and its existence erased from official history. Buildings partially buried by a mud flood that simultaneously destroyed the old civilization and concealed its existence. Orphaned children filling empty cities. A new population installed without knowledge of the world that had preceded them. The old maps with their Tartaria labels. The grand neoclassical buildings of 19th century cities with their ground floors apparently sunk below street level. The orphan trains that moved children across the American continent in the late 19th century. These are the visual evidence the theory assembles. Each element, taken in isolation, is a real historical phenomenon. The maps exist. The buildings exist. The orphan trains happened. The theory's power comes from assembling them into a pattern and offering that pattern as the explanation for the feeling of discovery. The explanation is wrong, but the feeling of discovery is real, and it points towards something real. Before examining how the theory works and why it spreads, it is worth naming what it gets right. The sense that something is missing from the standard Western historical account of the 19th century and its antecedents is not unfounded. The history of Inner Asia, as this investigation has tried to demonstrate across the preceding chapters, is genuinely underrepresented in Western public historical consciousness. There are real gaps, real peoples with real histories that Western education systems have not adequately conveyed. The intuition that something has been left out is not wrong. The theory's explanation of what has been left out and why is what fails. Joan Donovan, whose research at the Harvard Shorenstein Center has examined the mechanisms by which false and misleading content spreads through digital media ecosystems, has documented the specific dynamics by which content of this kind finds and retains audiences. The key mechanisms are not primarily about the logical persuasiveness of the content. They are about emotional resonance, community belonging, and the way that social media algorithms reward engagement over accuracy. A video that produces the feeling of discovery in its viewers generates a specific kind of shareable engagement. The algorithm reads that engagement as evidence of quality and promotes the content to more viewers. The community of believers grows, and as it grows, it provides social reinforcement that makes individual questioning harder rather than easier. The GNet, the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, has documented the Tartarian mud flood theory as a case study in how pseudo-historical content can function as a gateway to broader conspiratorial worldviews. The theory's specific content: a hidden empire, a historical reset, falsified official history, maps onto a general framework of institutional distrust that can be extended to cover a wide range of subjects. Communities that form around the theory develop the shared vocabulary and mutual reinforcement that make more extreme conspiratorial claims easier to accept. The visual evidence deserves direct examination, because it is the most compelling part of the theory for first-time viewers, and also the part most easily explained by ordinary historical process. Old photographs of mid-19th century American city streets do show buildings whose ground floors appear to sit lower, relative to street level, than they do today. This is a real visual phenomenon. It has a real explanation that has nothing to do with mud floods or hidden empires. Cities raise their street levels over time. They fill in low-lying areas, Install underground infrastructure that requires excavation and backfill, and build up layers of paving over earlier surfaces as maintenance accumulates. A building constructed in 1850 might find its ground floor sitting several feet lower relative to street level by 1950. Not because it sank into a mud flood, but because the street around it was raised by a century of urban development. Urban stratigraphy is a standard topic in archaeological methodology. Municipal archives in most American and European cities hold construction records, street-grade surveys, and infrastructure documentation that show exactly how and when street levels changed. This evidence does not support the mud flood theory. It explains, through entirely mundane processes, the visual phenomena the theory presents as mysterious. The evidentiary structure of the Tartarian mud flood theory illustrates a principle about how conspiracy theories handle evidence that goes well beyond this specific case. Conspiracy theories of this kind are not falsifiable in the way that scientific hypotheses are falsifiable. Not because their proponents are stupid or irrational, but because the theory has been structured to incorporate its own defense against falsification. Evidence that supports the theory is presented as confirmation. Evidence that contradicts the theory is presented as evidence of the suppression that the theory predicts. The absence of evidence for the theory is presented as evidence that the evidence has been destroyed or hidden. Every possible response to the theory becomes, within the theory's own framework, further evidence for it. This logical structure, which philosophers of science call unfalsifiability, is the fundamental characteristic that distinguishes conspiracy theories from genuine historical hypotheses. A genuine historical hypothesis could in principle be shown to be wrong if the evidence demanded it. A conspiracy theory has been structured so that no evidence could show it to be wrong. Mike Rothschild, whose analysis of QAnon and related conspiracy theories has examined the psychological and social dynamics of belief in elaborate conspiratorial frameworks, has noted that the emotional appeal of these theories is often more important than their logical structure. The feeling of having special knowledge, of belonging to a community of the epistemically privileged, provides satisfactions that persist even when specific claims within the theory are shown to be incorrect. The community is the product. The specific claims are the mechanism by which the community is formed and maintained. Serious historical inquiry works in the opposite direction. It is uncomfortable with its own conclusions. It actively seeks evidence that might challenge the picture it is developing. It changes its conclusions when evidence demands it. It is, in short, a practice designed to minimize the influence of what the investigator wants to be true on what the investigator concludes is true. The mud flood did not happen. The reset did not happen. The Tartarian Empire did not exist in the form the theory describes. What did happen is what this investigation has been tracing. A real civilization of enormous complexity and achievement, covered for 5 centuries by a label that European tradition used to avoid learning anything about it, finally beginning to receive the serious scholarly attention it deserves, and still, in significant measure, absent from the historical consciousness of the Western public that the conspiracy theory is trying to reach. The theory is reaching the right audience with the wrong story. The right story is harder. It requires learning names and histories that the standard Western education did not provide. But it is the true one, and it is more interesting than any hidden empire. The buildings are real. The mystery is not how impossible they are. The mystery is how easily visible labor disappears from beauty. Stand in front of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg and consider what you are looking at. The facade stretches for roughly 230 meters along the Neva River embankment. It rises 4 stories, topped with a balustrade decorated with over 170 sculpted figures. The interior contains over 1,500 rooms, over 1,700 windows, and over 100 staircases. The building was completed in its present form in 1762. After a reconstruction supervised by the Italian architect Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli, who had spent his career in the service of the Russian imperial court. The archival record of this construction and reconstruction is extensive. The Russian imperial court maintained detailed records of its building projects for administrative and financial reasons, and those records have been preserved in the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg. They include contracts with suppliers of materials, wage records for workers, correspondence between the court and the architects directing the construction, inventories of materials used, and accounts of the various crises, financial, logistical, and political, that affected the projects over time. These records do not describe anything impossible or mysterious. They describe exactly how a large and complex building was constructed in 18th century Russia, with enormous quantities of human labor, with materials sourced from across the empire and from European suppliers, with skills brought in from Italy and France and Germany, alongside local craftsmen whose traditions the court had been developing for generations, and with the kind of organizational effort that only a powerful, centralized state, commanding vast resources, could sustain. The people who built the Winter Palace were not phantoms. They were serfs, state peasants, and hired craftsmen, working under conditions that ranged from poorly compensated to effectively enslaved, depending on their legal status and the specific phase of construction. The mortality rate among workers on major St. Petersburg construction projects in the early 18th century was significant. The conditions in which workers lived during the construction seasons were harsh by any standard. These facts are in the archive. They are not hidden. They have simply not been the part of the story that the buildings were designed to tell about themselves. This is the hidden history of the grand buildings that the Tartarian conspiracy theory finds so mysterious. Not a hidden empire with advanced technology. The hidden history is the labor, the bodies, the lives of the people who built these things with their hands under conditions that the people who commissioned and inhabited the buildings preferred not to think about too carefully. The conspiracy theory inverts the actual historical mystery. It asks how ordinary people of the 19th century could have built these structures. And it answers its own question by proposing that they did not, that the buildings were inherited from a more advanced civilization. What it does not ask is how a small number of extremely wealthy and powerful people organized the labor of hundreds of thousands of poor people to create environments of extraordinary beauty for themselves, and how the experience of the people who did the building got so thoroughly excluded from the story of the buildings they built. The answer to that question is not mysterious. It is documented. It is the story of serfdom in Russia, of enslaved labor in the American South, of colonial forced labor across the European imperial world. These mechanisms were not hidden. They were the explicit and legal foundations of the societies that built the grand buildings of the 18th and 19th centuries. Kazan offers a particularly instructive example. After the conquest of 1552, Ivan IV commissioned the construction of the Annunciation Cathedral within the Kazan Kremlin as a monument to the Russian victory. The cathedral was built on the site of a mosque that had been demolished. Its construction used materials from demolished Tatar structures. The labor was organized through the Russian imperial system that had just conquered the city. The cathedral still stands. It is a genuine architectural achievement. It is also a building whose existence required the destruction of what preceded it, and whose construction organized the labor of a newly conquered population under the direction of the conquering power. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The building is beautiful. The process that produced it was violent. Understanding the building fully requires understanding both. James Cracraft, whose scholarship on the Petrine Revolution in Russian architecture has traced the development of the Russian imperial building tradition from Peter I through the 18th century, has documented in detail how the skills and traditions that produced the grand buildings of St. Petersburg were assembled. Peter brought Italian architects to Russia. He sent Russian craftsmen to study in Western Europe. He established schools of architecture and applied arts. He used the coercive power of the state to direct labor toward his building projects on a scale that would not have been possible in a less autocratic political system. The result was a tradition of monumental architecture that was, within a few generations, genuinely sophisticated and capable of producing work of the highest quality. This tradition did not fall from the sky. It was built, deliberately and at significant human cost, through a process of skill transfer, institutional development, and forced labor mobilization that the archive documents in considerable detail. Richard Wortman, whose work Scenarios of Power examines the relationship between Russian imperial architecture and imperial self-presentation, argues that the grand buildings of the Russian imperial tradition were performances of power, designed to communicate specific messages about the nature and legitimacy of imperial authority. Understanding these buildings as performances of power, rather than simply as aesthetic objects, changes what questions we ask about them. Instead of asking how they were built, which has clear archival answers, we can ask what they were built to communicate, and what was excluded from the story they were designed to tell. The exclusion of labor from the story of grand architecture is not unique to Russia or to the 19th century. The pyramids of Egypt do not commemorate the workers who built them. The cathedrals of medieval Europe do not commemorate the craftsmen who carved their stone. The plantation houses of the American South do not commemorate the enslaved people whose labor made them possible. In each case, the monument communicates the power and vision of those who commissioned it. The people who built it with their hands are present in the structure itself, in the physical labor embodied in every stone and every carved surface. But absent from the story the structure tells about itself. The Tartarian conspiracy theory, paradoxically, reproduces this erasure while claiming to challenge it, by proposing that the grand buildings were inherited from a lost civilization rather than built by the people of their own time. The theory removes the actual builders from the narrative entirely. The workers who raised the walls and carved the facades and laid the floors disappear from the story, replaced by a mysterious advanced civilization that left no other trace of its existence. The streets were raised by urban development. The orphan trains carried the children of industrial-era poverty and family disruption, documented in the records of the charitable organizations that ran them. The history of the 19th century was recorded in extraordinary detail by a society that had developed print culture, photography, and bureaucratic record-keeping to a degree that makes it one of the most thoroughly documented periods in human history. The question the Tartaria theory asks, how could they have built this, erases the people who actually built it. The question the archive answers, who was forced to build this and under what conditions, restores them. The second question is harder to sit with. It asks something about the societies that built these monuments, rather than something about a mystery that conveniently locates the builders elsewhere. That is why the archives matter more than the mud flood. The Tartaria problem looks different depending on where you stand when you look at it. Stand in Amsterdam in 1670, and you see a vast, imprecisely labeled zone covering half the Asian continent, a space your maps can name but not describe. Stand in Beijing in the same year, and you see something entirely different. A set of specific peoples with specific names, specific political histories, specific relationships to the Chinese imperial court, documented in administrative records that had been accumulating for centuries before European cartographers put the word Tartaria on their first map. The gap between those two perspectives is the subject of this chapter, and examining what the Chinese administrative tradition knew about the space that European maps called Tartaria reveals something important that the previous chapters have not fully addressed. European cartographic ignorance about Inner Asia was not a universal failure of human knowledge. It was a failure specific to a particular tradition working from particular limitations. Other traditions knew. They had always known. The Chinese archives organized the peoples of Inner Asia not by a single vague label, but by specific names, corresponding to specific political and historical realities. Begin with the Xiongnu, the confederation of steppe peoples that challenged the Han dynasty from roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era through the 2nd century of the Common Era, is documented in Chinese sources with enough detail to allow modern historians to reconstruct their political organization, their military methods, their diplomatic relationships with China, and the internal divisions that eventually led to their fragmentation. The Han dynasty's historian Sima Qian devoted a substantial section of his records of the Grand Historian to the Xiongnu, treating them not as an undifferentiated zone of northern menace, but as a specific political entity with a specific history, specific rulers, specific decisions, and specific consequences. That specificity matters enormously. When you read Sima Qian on the Xiongnu, alongside what European chronicles of the same era say about the peoples north and east of their known world, the contrast is stark. The Chinese tradition names specific rulers, records specific diplomatic exchanges, traces specific political developments over time. The European tradition, working from far less direct contact, reaches for categories that convey threat without conveying understanding. That asymmetry did not close for nearly 2,000 years. Chinese archives knew specific names. That is the first layer of the contrast. The Persian tradition adds the second layer, connected histories. Persian geographic and historical writing from the 9th century onward produced sophisticated documentation of Central Asia and the steppe zone that drew on both direct observation and a long tradition of engagement with the cultures of Inner Asia. The Persian historian and physician al-Biruni, writing in the early 11th century, produced geographic and ethnographic descriptions of the peoples of Central and Inner Asia that were, by any reasonable measure, more accurate and more detailed than anything available in European geographic writing of the same period. Al-Biruni had traveled extensively and had access to sources across the Islamic world. His descriptions of the peoples of the steppe and Central Asia named specific peoples with specific cultural and political identities, rather than grouping them under undifferentiated labels. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian and administrator who served the Ilkhanate Mongol court in Persia in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, produced a universal history, the Jami al-Tawarikh, that remains one of the most important sources for Mongol history from any tradition. Writing in Persian with access to Mongolian oral and documentary sources as well as Chinese and Islamic historical materials, Rashid al-Din produced a history of the Mongol Empire that named specific individuals, described specific events, and placed the Mongol world in a geographic and historical context of extraordinary detail. This work was being produced while European cartographers were still working out where to place the Tartaria label on their maps. Persian archives knew connected histories. That is the second layer. The third layer is the one that makes the Tartaria problem most visible from the outside. European maps ignored both, not because the information was unavailable. The linguistic barrier was real. Few European scholars read Persian, or Arabic, or Chinese, and the translation of texts in these languages into European languages was a slow and incomplete process. But the linguistic barrier does not fully explain the depth of European ignorance about Inner Asia. The problem was not just absence of information. It was absence of interest in the kind of specific, detailed knowledge that the Chinese and Persian traditions had been producing for centuries. The Tartaria label was, for European purposes, good enough, and good enough, when sustained across 5 centuries of cartographic tradition, produces a particular kind of blindness that becomes structural, inherited, and increasingly difficult to question precisely because it is so thoroughly built into the available vocabulary. By the time the Qing dynasty came to power in the 17th century, China had developed administrative infrastructure for governing Inner Asia of extraordinary sophistication. The Lai Fan Yuan, the court of colonial affairs, established by the Qing dynasty, was responsible for administering the non-Chinese subjects of the empire, including the Mongols, the Tibetans, and the various Central Asian peoples who came under Qing authority, it produced its own documentary tradition in Manchu, Mongolian, and Tibetan, as well as Chinese, providing Qing administrators with a level of specific, detailed knowledge about the peoples and territories of Inner Asia that European cartographic tradition, working from the Tartaria label, could not have matched. Pamela Kyle Crossley, whose work on the Manchu Qing dynasty has examined how the Qing court understood and administered its vast multi-ethnic empire, has argued that the Qing dynasty's approach to governing Inner Asia was built on a sophisticated understanding of the specific cultural and political traditions of the peoples it ruled. The Qing court maintained separate administrative structures for Chinese, Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, and various Central Asian populations, each calibrated to the specific cultural traditions of the relevant community. Thomas Alson, whose scholarship on cultural exchange in the Mongol Empire has been fundamental to the modern understanding of how the Pax Mongolica facilitated the movement of knowledge and technology across Eurasia, has argued that the Mongol Empire itself created conditions for significant knowledge transfer between Chinese, Persian, and Islamic traditions. Mongol Kurth, which brought scholars and craftsmen from across the empire to serve at the imperial center, functioned as nodes in a network of knowledge transfer that connected Chinese astronomical and mathematical traditions with Islamic and Persian ones. None of this specificity was available to European cartographers working with the Tartaria label. And that is precisely the point. Chinese archives knew specific names. Persian archives knew connected histories. European maps ignored both. Not because they were kept secret, but because the institution of European cartography had decided, across 5 centuries of accumulated habit, that the word Tartaria was sufficient. When someone asks what was hidden behind the Tartaria label, the honest answer is, nothing was hidden. The information about what was there was available in Chinese, in Persian, in Arabic, in Mongolian, in Manchu, in Tibetan. It was available to anyone willing to learn the languages and engage seriously with the documentary traditions of the civilizations that had been living in and governing and describing these territories for centuries before European cartographers put the label on their maps. The knowledge existed. It was simply in languages that the people drawing the maps had chosen not to learn, describing a world that the people drawing the maps had decided. Through the accumulated inertia of 5 centuries of habit, they did not need to understand. That is what the Chinese archives knew. Not a secret. A history. Specific. Continuous. Documented. And never missing from the world. Only missing from the map. St. Petersburg, 1903. In the reading rooms of the Imperial Public Library, a 40-year-old Russian scholar named Vasily Vladimirovich Barthold works through manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Chagatai Turkic, languages he has spent years mastering with a specific purpose in mind. He has been assembling, from the collections available to him in St. Petersburg and from published editions of key texts, a body of primary source material about Central Asia that no European scholar before him had engaged with at this depth. The chronicles, the geographic descriptions, the administrative documents, the literary works produced by Central Asian scholars in the centuries before and after the Mongol conquests. He is reading them in the original languages, cross-referencing Arabic accounts against Persian ones, checking geographic descriptions against what he knows of the actual terrain from the accounts of Russian travelers and administrators who had moved through the region in the preceding century. The work he is completing will be published in Russian in 1904 as Turkestan, down to the Mongol invasion. It will represent something genuinely new in the European scholarly tradition's engagement with the history of Inner Asia, a work of historical scholarship that treats Central Asian history as a subject deserving the same kind of serious, primary source-based analysis that European historians apply to European history. Barthold is opening a door that has been closed for centuries. What is on the other side is not a mystery or a secret. It is simply history that had been written in languages that European scholarship had not been reading. He opens his door. The Chagatai manuscripts are in front of him. He begins. His work is a genuine breakthrough. It is also, by his own acknowledgement, incomplete in ways that reflect the limits of what a single scholar working in the early 20th century could accomplish. The documentary tradition of Inner Asia was produced in multiple languages: Arabic, Persian, Chagatai Turkic, Mongolian, Manchu, Chinese, Tibetan, and various other languages depending on the specific region and period. No single scholar could command all of these languages with the depth necessary to work directly with primary sources across the full range. Barthold's strength was in the Islamic Central Asian tradition. His engagement with Chinese and Mongolian sources was less thorough, and the Tibetan tradition was effectively outside his scope. These limitations did not diminish what he achieved. They simply meant that the field he was helping to found had more doors to open than any one person could reach. René Grousset was standing at one of those other doors when he published The Empire of the Steppes in French in 1939. His scope was broader than Barthold's. A synthetic narrative history of the steppe peoples, from the earliest documented period through the Mongol Empire and its aftermath. For several decades, his work was the standard Western reference for the broad outlines of steppe history. But Grousset pushed his door open only partway. His narrative organized the steppe world around a concept of civilization that placed settled agricultural societies at a higher developmental stage than pastoral ones. His steppe peoples were forces of disruption and destruction rather than creators of their own civilizational forms. His admiration for the military achievements of the Mongols was genuine, but it was the admiration of someone who sees them primarily as military phenomena. The urban and intellectual achievements of the steppe-adjacent world, the cities and scholarly traditions and artistic production that the previous chapters of this investigation have tried to describe, received less sustained attention in his account. The door he opened was narrower than the opening the field eventually needed. Peter Golden spent his career building the linguistic foundation that the field required after Grousset. His introduction to the history of the Turkic peoples, published in 1992, opened a door that no previous Western scholar had opened at this depth: the Turkic documentary tradition. Golden had developed competence in Turkic languages, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, and several other relevant languages, allowing him to work directly with primary sources across a wider range than any of his predecessors. Behind that door was a history of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. The history of the Turkic peoples across more than a millennium of steppe and urban civilization that had been sitting in libraries waiting for someone with the right linguistic keys. What he found was not a mystery. It was a history that had simply not been read by people in a position to bring it to wider scholarly attention. Nicolas de Cosmo opened a different door: the Chinese frontier records. His work on the early history of the Chinese-steppe interaction drew on both Chinese documentary sources and archaeological evidence to challenge the traditional view that the steppe peoples who pressured China's northern borders were simply chaotic raiding forces without coherent political organization. Behind de Cosmo's door was a picture of dynamic, reciprocal relationship, a steppe world that was shaped by China as much as it threatened China, and that had its own internal complexity that Chinese sources, read carefully and with the right questions, could illuminate in ways that no previous Western synthetic account had adequately captured. Thomas Olson opened the door to what happened inside the Mongol Empire when it connected China to Persia, to the Western steppe within a single political framework. His work on commodity exchange, cultural transfer, and the movement of scholars and craftsmen across the Mongol world showed something that Grousset had looked at but not fully entered: not simply military conquest, but an extraordinary experiment in Eurasian connectivity that transformed the cultural and intellectual landscape of the continent in ways that are still being mapped by scholars working in archives from Beijing to Tehran to St. Petersburg. Each of these scholars opened a door that had been closed, not because what was behind it was secret, but because the people with the right keys had not been trying the lock. The knowledge existed. The archives existed. The manuscripts existed. What had been lacking was the combination of linguistic training, archival access, and the intellectual willingness to ask questions that European tradition had not been asking. The blind spots that remain after a century of serious scholarly engagement are worth naming honestly, because they indicate where genuine knowledge gaps persist rather than where secrets have been hidden. The most significant is linguistic. Very few individual scholars command more than a subset of the relevant languages at the level necessary for primary source work. The Mongolian documentary tradition has been less thoroughly integrated into Western scholarship than the Islamic, Persian, and Chinese traditions. Because Mongolian language expertise is rarer in Western academic institutions than Arabic or Chinese expertise. The Tibetan tradition, which includes significant documentation of the Mongol period from the perspective of Buddhist communities that maintained complex relationships with Mongol courts, is similarly underrepresented. The archival situation in Central Asian republics has improved significantly since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Soviet restrictions on archival access and Soviet ideological pressures on the interpretation of Central Asian history constrained the field for most of the 20th century in ways that scholars working in the post-Soviet environment have been gradually addressing. Uzbek, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tajik, and Turkmen scholars working with archives in their own countries have produced substantial scholarship that is not always well integrated into the Western academic literature. This is a form of institutional blind spot rather than an intellectual one. The field has the primary sources. It has scholars capable of engaging with those sources. What it sometimes lacks is adequate mechanisms for integrating scholarship produced in Central Asian languages by Central Asian scholars into the broader literature that shapes how the field is represented to Western academic audiences. Barthold opened his door in 1903. Golden and Dai Cosmo and Olson opened theirs in the decades that followed. The scholars working today in archives from Almaty to Ulaanbaatar to Istanbul are opening more doors still, each one revealing more of what was always there, always documented, never hidden, only unread by the people who had decided that a single word was sufficient to describe half the world. The history is being recovered. The work is not finished, but the direction is clear. There is a question that has been running underneath every chapter of this investigation, surfacing occasionally in explicit form, but present throughout as the organizing concern that gave the investigation its shape. The question is not whether Tartaria was a real empire. It was not. The evidence for that conclusion is not ambiguous, and this investigation has not treated it as ambiguous. No ruler called himself Emperor of Tartaria. No capital city served as its administrative center. No legal code. No currency. No military command operated under that banner. The word was a European geographic label, applied to a region that European tradition did not understand, perpetuated by a cartographic habit that copied labels more readily than it verified them, and finally retired in the 19th century, when the intellectual and political conditions that had sustained it were replaced by conditions that demanded more precision. That conclusion is established. It is not the interesting question. The interesting question is, what was actually in the space that the label covered? Why Western historical consciousness has such a thin relationship with that content, and what the consequences of that thinness have been for how the world has been understood and governed and argued about across the past several centuries. The Eurasian steppe was home to civilizations of genuine sophistication and genuine achievement. The cities of the steppe world, Karakorum and Sarai and Samarkand and Bukhara and Urgench and dozens of others, were not minor settlements. They were major urban centers with populations. Institution. and cultural traditions that compared favorably by any serious measure with the great cities of contemporary Europe, Persia, and China. The trade networks that crossed the steppe connected the economies of China and the Islamic world and Byzantium and eventually Europe in ways that shaped the material culture of all of them. The political formations that organized steppe life, from the Xiongnu through the various Turkic confederations through the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire by area in human history, and through the successor khanates, were sophisticated political entities that commanded the resources and the loyalty of tens of millions of people. None of this was a secret. None of it was suppressed. It was documented in Chinese and Persian and Arabic and Mongolian and in the accounts of European travelers who actually went and looked. The documentation existed. The scholarly engagement with that documentation has been growing and deepening for over a century. What was absent was not documentation or scholarship. What was absent was the kind of broad public knowledge, the common cultural fluency with the history of Inner Asia, that Western education systems developed for European history and, to a lesser extent, for the histories of China and India. A reasonably educated American or European adult in the 21st century can be expected to know something about the Roman Empire, something about medieval European kingdoms, something about the Renaissance and the Reformation. The same person can probably place the Tang dynasty somewhere in Chinese history, and may know something about the Mughal Empire in India. Their knowledge of the Mongol Empire is likely limited to the name Genghis Khan and a general impression of military ferocity. Their knowledge of the Uyghur Empire, the Khitan Liao dynasty, the Jurchen Jin dynasty, the Chagatai Khanate, the Timurid Empire, the Golden Horde and its successor Khanates, is likely to be essentially non-existent. These names are not part of the common historical vocabulary of Western-educated culture in the way that the Roman Empire or the British Empire are part of that vocabulary. That gap is real. It is significant. And it is the gap that the Tartarian conspiracy theory is, in its confused and misdirected way, responding to. The people who find the Tartaria theory compelling are people who sense that something is missing from the historical account they have been given. They are not wrong to sense it. Something is missing. The history of the most dynamic and most transformative political and cultural space in Eurasia between roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 18th century of the Common Era is largely absent from Western public historical consciousness. What the conspiracy theory gets wrong is not the sense of a gap, but the explanation for it. The theory explains the gap as deliberate suppression. The actual explanation is considerably more mundane and considerably more uncomfortable. The gap exists because of the sustained operation of assumptions that shaped what Western educational systems taught, what Western publishing industries produced, and what Western academic institutions funded. Those assumptions were not a conspiracy. They were the ordinary expression of the biases of the societies that produced them. Assumptions about which civilizations were central to human history and which were peripheral, about which languages were worth learning and which were secondary, about which archives held important documents and which held material of lesser significance. Those assumptions had real consequences for real people. When the history of a people is not taught, when their language is not learned, when their archives are not consulted, when their scholars are not read, the effect is a practical deficit in understanding that shapes how those people are perceived, how their claims are evaluated, how their suffering is registered or not registered in the moral consciousness of the people who do not know their history. The Crimean Tatars deported in 1944 were deported from a homeland that most of the world had no knowledge of. The Kazakhs, who died in the famine of the early 1930s, died in a catastrophe that the world was not paying attention to. The Volga Tatars, who maintained their language and culture across 5 centuries of Russian governance, did so in a near invisibility that the Western world had constructed for them by putting a single label on their ancestors, world, and moving on. This is not a claim that knowing the history of Inner Asia would have prevented these catastrophes. The claim is more modest and more specific. When catastrophes happen to people whose history is not known, the moral response of the outside world is diminished, not by indifference, but by ignorance. You cannot grieve for a community you have never heard of. You cannot advocate for the rights of a people whose existence is not part of your common knowledge. The Tartarian conspiracy theory fills the gap with a fantasy. The fantasy is dramatic and visually compelling and emotionally satisfying in the way that stories about hidden empires and suppressed truth are always emotionally satisfying. It offers the pleasure of discovery and the comfort of explanation. What it does not offer is the actual history. The actual history is harder. It requires learning names that are unfamiliar and placing them in contexts that the standard Western historical education has not provided. It requires sitting with the reality that the gap in Western historical knowledge is not the result of a dramatic conspiracy, but of the ordinary, undramatic, sustained operation of assumptions that privileged some histories over others, for reasons that had everything to do with power and nothing to do with the relative importance of the histories being prioritized or neglected. Several things are worth naming directly as this investigation closes. Tartaria was a label. It covered a world that the people who used the label did not understand and did not, for most of the 5 centuries during which they used it, particularly want to understand. The world is still there. Its history is documented in archives scattered across a dozen countries, in languages that relatively few Western scholars have mastered, in scholarship that has been accumulating for over a century and that has fundamentally changed the understanding of what Inner Asia was and what it accomplished. The peoples who descend from the world that Tartaria labeled are still here. The Tatars of the Volga and the Crimea, the Kazakhs of the vast steppe, the Uzbeks of the great oasis cities, the Mongolians of the eastern grassland, the dozens of other communities whose ancestors lived in the space that a European cartographer once covered with a single word. They are peoples with ongoing histories, ongoing cultural lives, ongoing negotiations with the states and systems that govern them. The scholarship that has been recovering and documenting and analyzing the history of these peoples and their predecessors is not finished. Every year adds new knowledge. Every new excavation, every newly studied manuscript, every newly translated chronicle adds detail and specificity to a picture that was, a century ago, almost entirely blank in Western scholarly consciousness. Guillaume Delisle dipped his pen in Paris in 1705 and wrote the word. He was not hiding anything. He was admitting, in the only way available to a cartographer who had to put something in the space where knowledge was absent, that he did not know what was there. The label is gone from maps. The world it failed to describe is still here. The people who called it home are still here. Their names were always their own. Their histories were always their own. Their presence was never contingent on being recognized by a cartographer in Paris. They knew what to write. They always did. Their names for themselves. Their names for their places. Their histories written in their own languages and preserved in their own documentary traditions were never missing from the world. They were only missing from the map. The map was wrong. The world was always there. It still is.